My name is Jen Munoz, and I am the program coordinator here at the Buchanan District Library. And I am pleased to introduce Andrew Kercher, who is doing a program on cryptids. So I will let him take it away. There you go.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. I'm excited. We practiced this earlier, so I'm going to share my screen here. Just have to pop over, and hopefully this will work again. There we go. Does that look right? I believe coming through on this end. So this is a topic that I've been pretty interested in. It's really a topic that's been very popular with a lot of museums in October, November, this kind of spooky time of the season. This is a lecture I first gave actually down in Livonia. I am from Port Huron. I'm a lecturer and historian by trade. And a buddy of mine is a librarian in Livonia. And they actually do their presentations by Dewey Decimal System. And so he had originally gotten a number and he wanted me to do a presentation on museums and handled that. That was no problem. And he said, okay, well, we moved on to the next number and it's cryptozoology. And he asked me, can you do something with that? And I never thought about that. And I said, well, let me think about it. And so I kind of came up with maybe a different take than what you might see from some other cryptid type talks or presentations, because I think it's very interesting. I was a philosophy major in undergrad. And so my idea or my plan was to be able to present some of the cryptids that not all cryptids have always been cryptids. And we'll actually talk a little bit about what that, definition is, because some people come and they are, hardcore fans. They've been out on a Bigfoot hunt. There's some people who say, I don't know what a cryptid is. So I've got something for kind of everybody in this presentation, but we'll look at some history. I think some really interesting stories of animals that turned out to be far more real than people thought at one time, and maybe give you a little bit of the benefit of the doubt at the very least about some of these other cryptids that, it's just not their time yet. So I think every good cryptid lecture starts with a little talk about David Hume. So Hume was a philosopher in the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. And believe me, just hold on, this will make sense in a second. He wrote about a number of different things. One of the problems he wrote about was the problem of induction. And the problem of induction is something that is a problem for science. It basically asks the question of, just because something has always happened one way in the past, what logical reason do you have to believe that it will continue to act that way into the future? And so that's Hume's question. I'll give you an example. This is his, I like this little comic, live each day. There's no truly rational reason to believe there will be another. But all right, imagine you get to flip a coin. I don't know if any of you are fans of No Country for Old Men. This guy likes to flip coins there. All right, so you flip a coin. What are the odds that it's heads? All right, it's about 50-50 if you've got a good, fair coin. So you flip that coin, it lands heads. Now let's say that same coin, you flip it, it lands heads 9 more times. So it's landed on its heads 10 times in a row. What are the odds the next time you flip that coin that it's still going to be heads or tails? Well, it's 50-50. Just because it landed on its head 10 times in the past doesn't mean that the next time you flip it, those odds are going to change. That past performance is no indicator of the future. It's kind of funny when if you go to a casino, sometimes they'll have you go by the roulette table and they'll have where the ball has landed the last 10 or 15 times, and people say, oh, it's red's turn or something like that. But that's kind of a logical fallacy. I really like, I found even a smartphone app that is a roulette tracker, like that's going to help you in some way. But it really won't. Obviously, with the green spaces there, the casino gets just a little bit of an edge. So that's how they can come out on top on something like that. But you're forced to then kind of ask a question. There's some real problems that come up with induction as well. Like you can look at past performance of things and you can say, well, there have been billions of humans who have lived, and every human who has ever died hasn't been me. So what logical reason do I have to think that I would ever die? It's never happened to me before, right? So you can kind of see there gets to be some issues. So what Hume was writing about, what I think is interesting, is he wrote that no amount of observations of white swans can allow the inference that all swans are white, but the observation of a single black swan is sufficient to refute that conclusion. So Hume, when he was writing in the 18th century, they had recently discovered the black swan. In Australia, swans were kind of definitionally white. That was what made a swan a swan. It had feathers, it has the long neck, it lives in a pond, and they're white, till they discovered, wait a second, there's a different kind of swan. There's a black swan. So now we can't say all swans are white anymore. So that's what I kind of use as my epistemological crowbar. If you keep just a little bit of an open mind and you really think about some of these cryptids that you've heard about, that we'll talk about, just because they haven't been discovered before doesn't mean that they're not out there. It's just that evidence has not come across us. I'll give you an example. One of the ways that I kind of thought about this is, again, as a philosophy undergrad, I worked with a professor that I turned in a paper once. I said something about a pink narwhal. And he said, "Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, what's the truth value of this statement about a fictional creature?" And I said, "Well, narwhals are real, Professor Midtalk." And he said, "Oh, really? I thought those were made up, like the unicorn of the sea." I said, "No, they're real." So for him, this narwhal was a cryptid. So that takes us to, like, what is a cryptid? Cryptids are these animals that kind of fit somewhere at the cross section of pop culture, biology, zoology, mythology, all of these things together. And every region of the world has lots of different cryptid stories, things that go bump in the night. Sometimes they fit in categories of, like, oh, we know they're made up. Sometimes it's like, oh, these are just unexplained, or they might be mistaken identity. There's a whole range of explanations for cryptids and the stories that go along with them. You know, some are very, very famous, like Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. That's one that just about everybody knows. To scary things like the chupacabra, right? This is like the Mexican, goat blood-sucking vampire creature. There have been supposed photos of the chupacabra. I always kind of chuckle that a lot of cryptids, maybe they're just blurry, right? Because photos are always blurry of them. But you look at those, and then you actually look at a picture of something like a coyote with mange, and you're like, oh, that maybe could explain something like that. There are cryptids like the Michigan Dog Man. This is one of my favorites. This is a local one. There has been one purported photo of this part dog, almost werewolf-like creature, and that's it. It is a little blurry, so it's all of like 10 pixels there. But there's some creatures like the Loveland frog that a number of people had seen. Actually, police in Loveland, Ohio, had claimed to have seen these large amphibious, like giant frog person hybrids on a couple of occasions. They were never able to get a photo or track them down, but multiple people had attested to seeing this. And so the Loveland Frogman has kind of grown into an attraction there in Loveland, Ohio, something they've really adopted, and they have now a festival every year for that. There are creatures like the jackalope. That's one that we kind of all know a little bit. That one's made up, but it's kind of fun. And then, they've even spread out different jackalopes from around the world of different kinds of these part rabbit, part antelope creatures with the horns there. There are some cryptids that are maybe a little bit more malicious than others, kind of have a dark side to them. Things like the Mothman, right, with the glowing red eyes from West Virginia, the Appalachian Mountains. There are things like the Jersey Devil. This goes all the way back to the 19th century. People saw this kind of terrifying upright horse goat with big wings in the Jersey Pine Barrens. There are things like Slender Man that come completely out of the internet. Like, we know that is not something that is misidentified. People might claim to see something that reminds them of this, but it's something that started online. So all different types. Now, I want to talk about one more person before we get into some of our examples of animals that really just turned out to be real. This is Alfred Wegener. He was a scientist, a German scientist, who was operating. He was a polar explorer and a geologist around the turn of the 20th century. And there was an idea that he proposed that was so radical 100 years ago that he was basically laughed out of his field. People did not really believe him and thought his ideas were so preposterous they did not take him seriously. And the idea that he had come up with was, he had looked at the world, he was putting together a puzzle, and he noticed that places like Africa and South America almost seem to fit together. It's maybe the continents haven't always been where they've been. And so he would actually come up with the theory of continental plates, and that the continents themselves can move around on the earth. And a lot of people said that's ridiculous. Earth is obviously a solid place. Everything's always been where it's been. And the idea that Earth is some kind of like fragile eggshell with cracks all the way around it was just nonsense. And so he was not taken seriously. But this idea of that, Earth once had a Pangea and the continents can move, really offered a lot of explanatory value. It explained, why we have earthquakes and volcanoes on these fault lines. There are actually animals that they have found fossil remains of that are spread across multiple continents. If you find an animal or plants that existed in South America, Africa, India, and Australia and Antarctica, well, those places are all pretty far apart from each other, but maybe they always haven't been. And so this was an idea that, again, went from absolutely no way to be taken seriously to, like, here's a YouTube clip of like Pangea for kids. This is something that's taught in basic elementary school earth science at this point. And so, Alfred Wegener didn't live long enough to see that, but I'm sure you'd appreciate that his theory is now taken as just basic science fact. And it was over the course of less than 100 years. So science can really change. So if you're ready, we'll plunge in to this field. We'll, take the red pill and see how deep the rabbit hole goes on some of these real life creatures. So the first one that I want to talk about, we have to go all the way back to ancient Carthage. So we're talking 500-600 BC. Carthage is a city in northern Africa, where modern day Tunis is today. And we want to talk about this guy. This is Hanno, the Navigator. As you might imagine, with a nickname like that, he was pretty involved in sailing. The Carthaginians were a Phoenician colony, and the Phoenicians were well known for how far they would travel. And Hanno was famous as going out beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which the Pillars of Hercules today we call the Straits of Gibraltar. So we'd actually head out and explore along the coast of Africa. And we have some translations of excerpts of his journal that have survived from 500-600 BC. So we know kind of where he went. We have some guesses about perhaps how far he went, some of the places that he would have seen based on what he's describing. Obviously, he didn't have access to modern maps or anything like that. So this is, I try to avoid long pieces of text, but I've got just a couple that it's easier in their own words. So as they're traveling in this, big trireme, they're kind of sailing down as best they can. They're coming across all sorts of new people and animals that they hadn't encountered before. So they said, sailing thence along the torrents of fire, we arrived after 3 days at a bay called the Horn of the South. This gulf was an island resembling the first island they had been on, with a lagoon, within which was another island full of savages. Most of them were women with hairy bodies, whom our interpreters had a name for. Although we chased them, we couldn't catch any males. They all escaped, being good climbers who defended themselves with stones. However, we caught 3 women who refused to follow those who carried them off, biting and clawing them. So we killed and flayed them and brought their skins back to Carthage. For we did not sail any further, our provisions were running short. So, this is an interesting question of, like, what were those interpreters calling? They had a name for these hairy, savage women that they said they had never seen before. And we usually play kind of a fun guessing game. So think to yourself, what might have they been called? And it's actually a name we're really familiar with, because they actually called them gorillas. And to us, gorilla doesn't sound like some kind of monstrous beast. We just know gorillas are a giant primate that live in Africa. Well, in 500 BC, gorillas were absolutely this cryptid, and they would remain so for a very long time. There's all sorts of great depictions of Hanno discovering gorillas. But as we're going to see time and time again, cryptids are typically only cryptids to one group of people. Hanno and these Europeans who have never encountered the gorillas are going somewhere else in the world. And they're like, oh, yeah, sure, there's an 800-pound hairy person who lives in the jungle who can, rip my arms off. And then they see it and they're like, oh, I couldn't believe you were telling the truth. Because the local indigenous people said, yeah, we know about gorillas. They live here. We are familiar with them. And so there are all sorts of depictions, again, of these gorillas that Hanno comes across. And gorillas would actually remain relatively mysterious for a long time because we have the advantage of photography, videography. We can see these. Gorillas seem like kind of a standard animal. It's not something you hope to see in your backyard, hopefully, if you live in Michigan. But like, you can go to the Detroit Zoo and they have gorillas. It's kind of an animal that a lot of people have seen firsthand visiting basically any major zoo. And especially female gorillas, you can see a little bit smaller there. So that's who they were carrying off. What's amazing to me is gorillas were not scientifically studied until well into the 19th century. Now, when we say scientifically studied, of course, talking about kind of Western European styles of science, People like Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century were starting this system where you use Latin words to, a two-term phrase to identify every unique species. We're all Homo sapiens. That's wise man. Gorillas are actually gorilla. It's the name of their species and their genus. But people saw remains of gorillas and like, wow, these are very obviously have to be related in maybe some way to humans. Look how similar they look in a lot of different ways. And so it's actually not until the 1840s that Jeffries Wyman would actually make a scientific catalog of gorillas. And there was actually an expedition in the 1850s by Mr. Paul Chelou to go out and get one of these gorillas, bring them back from equatorial Africa to display, or at least study. He was able to successfully capture a couple of gorillas alive, brought back more specimens for the scientific community to really take a deep dive into. And his excerpts, if you take a look at his book sometime, he does well in the speaking circuit. He goes and he finds these animals, and you don't feel too bad for this gorilla because that gorilla almost immediately bent up the rifle and beat one of the porters to death with it. But Mr. Paul Chelou would actually head out. He would shoot a lot of different animals on his expedition. That was kind of the way of these expeditions in the 19th century, but they did capture some of those gorillas alive as well. What's really interesting is there are a number of different types of gorilla. Western lowland gorillas are kind of the most common, but we know about several subspecies as well today. And what I think is really, really interesting was that the eastern gorilla, these are mountain gorillas, were not discovered until the 20th century. So this is a guy, Friedrich Robert von Beringa. He's German. He said, from our campsite, we were able to watch a herd of big black monkeys which tried to climb the crest of the volcano. We succeeded in killing 2 of these animals, and with a rumbling noise, they tumbled into a ravine, which had its opening in a northeasterly direction. After 5 hours of strenuous work, we succeeded in retrieving one of these animals using a rope. A big human-like male monkey of 1.5 meters in height and a weight of more than 200 pounds. His chest had no hair, and his hands and feet were of enormous size. Unfortunately, I was unable to determine its type. Because of its size, it could not very well be a chimpanzee or a gorilla. In any case, the presence of gorillas had not been established in the area around the lake. It's 1902. So when we talk about some of these animals, there was a whole colony of a different species of gorilla completely unknown to science until into the 20th century. And those are big animals, right? When you look at a mountain gorilla, they are not small, something that could maybe easily avoid detection. So it adds a little bit more plausibility that some of these cryptids that are out there could avoid human contact. And if they don't want to be found, well, maybe they won't be found, right? It's not too unplausible to think about something like that. Now, the next story I want to tell you, this is a creature that a lot of people, this is a still, of course, from King Kong. Although we were just talking about gorillas, this is actually a different animal that inspired the story of King Kong. This is the Isle of, this is Indonesia. And Indonesia has tens of thousands of islands, some of which are pretty big, very heavily populated. Some are pretty small. And Indonesia was a Dutch colony. And when the Dutch had moved in, they had been getting stories by the 17th century of an island nearby that had a giant man-eating lizard, a giant monster that could devour a person, like some kind of giant dinosaur. And I think there's 2 kinds of people in the world when they hear that there's an island with a giant man-eating dinosaur. Some people who say, oh, good to know, I'll avoid that island. And other people, like Lieutenant Jacques Karl Henry von Steen von Heinsbroek, who was in the Dutch army, said, well, I'm going to go shoot that. That's what he did. He went to this island, and if you haven't guessed from this photo, that island is the island of Komodo, and that's where he would discover the Komodo dragon. These are the largest lizards on Earth, and this will give you a sense of scale for how big one of these are, and it's not too unreasonable to see how one of these could easily eat a person. They're very kind of dangerous animals. They have a very, very poisonous bite. There's so much bacteria in their mouth. They're very, very strong. They can kind of sneak up on people. They work as solitary hunters out in the jungle. They grow up tough on this island for sure. And what's really interesting is that a lot of animals, when they wind up on an island, they grow kind of smaller over the years because there's less resources on the island. But they have found large number of vertebrae and remains from kind of an ancestor of this Komodo dragon that was around probably 20 to 30,000 years ago. It was even bigger than what you see today. This thing was enormous. It stands half as tall as a person, 7 meters long. So that is enormous and easy to see how that could drag somebody off from a cave. And if you were a caveman and you saw somebody eat this in prehistory, one of your friends be eaten, this is probably going to make it into your oral histories for sure. So these stories would circulate for thousands of years. So what's really interesting, and the inspiration, as I mentioned, for King Kong comes from an expedition by William Douglas Burden, who wrote a number of books about expeditions around the world. He was kind of a zoologist. He would head out on these adventures, and he was actually contracted by the Smithsonian. So the Komodo dragon that are on display in the Smithsonian are actually the ones that he went out and brought back alive in the 1910s. There was this expedition to an exotic South Pacific island to capture what they thought was maybe, a not extinct dinosaur or something from ancient times that was unknown to science and be exhibited. And they brought him back alive. They sadly died after about 6 months and just couldn't handle the shock of the move, but they were stuffed. And if you go to the Museum of Natural History today, those are the same Komodo dragons that you'll see on display there today. Later on, he would actually found Marineland of Florida, just as kind of an aside. Interesting guy. Founds the first theme park in Florida. And as I mentioned, his story becomes basically the basic plot points for King Kong. Such an interesting story. Now, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. This guy is John Hunter. Hunter was a member of the Royal Navy in the 18th century. And the Royal Navy, especially in the 18th century, after the American Revolution, when America had gained its independence as a new country in the United States, the United Kingdom spent a lot of resources in some new colonies, and one of which was Australia, rather famous as one of their penal colonies, a place to sentence your prisoners to exile. They have to go. They're going to be transported to Australia. Transportation being a common punishment in the early part of the 19th century in the United Kingdom. Well, Australia was so far away, it's hard to get a grasp on just how different it would be and how difficult it would be to get to a place like that, because Hunter is a good example of one of these admirals who would go on this trip that would take 9 months. So if you can imagine, the only thing I can think of today that'd be an equivalent would be like a trip to Mars. They would be very careful in what they would pack, what they would bring, to know exactly how much space they have, which was limited on these ships. And so Hunter would actually get in trouble when they would send back all sorts of animals, plants, flora, fauna, back to the United Kingdom for them to investigate at places like the Royal Society, and they would catalog them. And he sent back an animal that was partially preserved and started to decay a little bit on this long trip. So it's an amphibious animal of the mole kind. And people said, what is this? This is not a very funny joke. We see you've clearly stitched a couple different animals together. But if you don't recognize this one is pretty famous for being a weird animal, right? This is the duck-billed platypus. One doesn't wear a hat, but there's a platypus for you. A duck-billed platypus that is such an odd duck, as it were, in terms of what this animal is like. It has kind of the tail of a beaver, this duck tail. They don't look like any other mammals. They really stand out in a number of different ways. There's a very, very cute baby duck-billed platypus, if you've never seen one before. And what's unique about these babies is they come from eggs. They are the only mammal that will lay in eggs, just like we talked about at the very beginning. All swans are white until they're not, until you find one that breaks the rule. So all mammals gave live birth until they found the duck-billed platypus, and they realized this is a mammal, but it does lay eggs. They're also the only venomous mammal. So they have a little spike in their back legs and a little gland that they can actually inject venom into an animal that they're fighting with. Fortunately, humans are a little big to be susceptible to it. But Australia is certainly a place where you're going to find lots of animals that are definitely fit that qualification of cryptids, at least at one time. This is a replica of ship the Batavia. This was the first European vessel to make it to Australia. The Batavia It's an interesting story. It could easily be its own whole hour-long presentation, but this was a Dutch ship with families on board. They get lost. There's a typhoon. There's a mutiny. They crash. They wind up on a deserted island. There's some light cannibalism. It's a pretty wild story. But at one point, the surviving families wind up on this basically literal desert island, this little spit of land, and all they have is kind of like one raft that they can send a few of the people over to the mainland to look for food. And some of the crew will go over to mainland Australia. They land on the western side of Australia, which is a little bit more desolate than the eastern side. And they said when they landed there, amongst these big trees was found a monstrous beast with the head of a fox, the hands of a man, the tail of a monkey, and that wonderful provision of nature, a bag in which to carry its young. Later on, Francisco Pelsart says, there are large numbers of cats, creatures of a miraculous form, as big as a hare, head similar to that of a civet cat. The forepaws are very short, about a finger long, wherein they have 5 small nails or fingers, as an ape's forepaw, and 2 hind legs that are half an ell long. They run on the flat of the joint of the leg, so they are not quick in running. The tail is very long, the same as a meerkat. They're going to eat, they sit on their hind legs, and they take food with 4 paws and eat exactly the same as the squirrels and apes do. So if you're thinking this sounds like something familiar, the big clue is that they find actually a wallaby. It sounds a lot like a kangaroo, but they're smaller. The big clue is the fact that they see this and they think, what a weird looking cat. That's how little of a frame of reference these Europeans have, that this is like the weirdest looking cat they've ever seen. Kangaroos are another great example, though, of some of these cryptid animals. This is Captain Cook, who would be famous in his trips to Australia in the 1770s. In fact, there is an interesting map that is drawn at the time. This is the first visual depiction of a kangaroo ever made. So this was on the drawing of a map, and you can see the kind of 4 corners of the world. There was a horse, a camel, a lion, and then this thing with like a long neck. It's got a pouch. It's got these long forearms. It's kind of awkward and ungainly looking, but that's what happens when you play a game of telephone and you're describing what a kangaroo looks like to somebody who's never seen one before. So certainly interesting. And here's the kangaroo, a different way of kind of pronouncing that before we settled on a spelling. From New Holland, George Stubbs drew this in the 1770s. So that was the first kangaroo drawn from life. And so there are certainly lots of these kangaroos all over Australia. One of the other things that's very interesting is they would say that every once in a while they'd say one of these kangaroos would get into a fist fight with one of the sailors. And they would say, yeah, right, sure, this thing that hops everywhere and it fights sailors. Well, actually, if you look at a kangaroo, when they stand up, they're pretty buff. I would not want to get into a fist fight with a kangaroo like that. They can kind of lean on their tail and really do a number on you for sure. And of course, to Aboriginal people who have lived in Australia since something like 50,000 BC, the kangaroo is not a mysterious animal. This was not a cryptid for those folks. This was just a cryptid to the Europeans. Because again, how many times has that happened throughout history? I'll give you a great example here in Port Huron. We have lots of black squirrels. In other parts of the state, there are maybe sometimes black squirrels, but every once in a while I'll have a friend over who is from another part of the state or from somewhere else. I'm like, what a weird thing. That squirrel's all black. I'm like, yeah, that's what a squirrel looks like. But only here, right? There's something they come from a small population of all black squirrels from Ontario, from Canada. They've come across the Blue Water Bridge and set up shop here. So it's all a matter of perspective for sure. So there's a little baby wallaby for you. Any chance I get to show you a baby animal, I will take it, because some of these cryptids get a little creepy looking for sure. So there's one other island I want to talk about, Fremantle Island, which is off the coast of Perth. Now, Fremantle Island is far enough away that animals can't, really swim back and forth. So it's an isolated population. Some really unique animals from an already unique continent have developed there. One of them is an animal called the quokka. And if you've never seen a quokka before, I will describe one to you, and you kind of get a mental picture of it. And I'll show you what they look like, because I think they are an interesting animal that not a lot of people have heard of, because they just live on this one little island. But they have the ears of a bear, kind of the nose of a pig. They're about the size of a groundhog. They have little squirrel hands, and they're the happiest animal I've ever seen. And when you actually see one in person, Yeah, that sure looks like a happy animal, just the way their face is built. It's like they have a little permanent smile all the time. They're super cute little animals. They're the top of their food chains. They're a protected species today because so few other animals have been introduced here. But an animal like this, if you didn't know that this was a real animal, this would look like something that AI would make up today. I think maybe we'll have a resurgence of some of these kind of cryptid creatures from just what a computer can imagine today. So let's talk about the unicorn. Well, this is another one of these interesting animals. The unicorn is the national animal of Scotland. There's a lot of different beliefs about where the stories of unicorns have come from. There are a few different examples. One of my favorites actually comes from a number of fossilized remains they had found in Europe. In fact, there's one great example from Germany where they had found some real remains. What a lot of people forget is that when you find a set of fossils, you rarely find an entire animal intact. It's usually, maybe an arm, part of the backbone, or maybe it's just the head. You don't find the whole thing. That's so rare, and that's why it's such a very expensive thing when they find like an entire fossilized T-Rex or something. So some coal miners in Germany found this in the 17th century. They did their best to put the few remains they had together into one animal. One very silly looking animal, which is like 2 legs and a tail and a head. This wouldn't really work anatomically, but what they had found, those were real remains because those were actually all the remnants of a woolly rhinoceros. These were some of the megafauna that went extinct about 50,000 years ago in Europe at the end of the last ice age. And so there definitely were these things that look a lot like a unicorn, one of these woolly rhinoceros. There are other examples as well. This is a really interesting mosaic from northern Africa from the Roman period. And boy, that sure looks like a unicorn, right? It's like, what is that? And there had actually been a lot of tales of one of these unicorns that lived in a small population in central sub-Saharan Africa. So Sir Henry Hamilton Johnson here, who's a very British looking man, you can see him in his suit there on the right and in a pith helmet there on the left. Had gotten these strips of cloth or strips of hide that had been preserved. So, well, this kind of looks a little bit like a zebra, but it doesn't really look the same. And, the grain's going the wrong way. What could this be? And so there were reports that this animal was 5 feet tall, 8 feet long, had the legs of a zebra, a body covered in reddish brown hair, a dark tongue like a giraffe, and cloven hooves. So what could this be? Well, he went with his guides into central sub-Saharan Africa. They had found even a skull, and they found the skull actually had 2 horns, but it looks from the side a lot more like a unicorn. And lo and behold, that skull belonged to an okapi. And the way that some of them, might have a horn that kind of grows very close together there in the center of their head, that looks just like what a lot of people describe as a unicorn. And boy, you talk about something with the legs of a giraffe, the reddish brown fur, and when it turns its head to the side, there you see that unicorn horn. And they are about 5 feet tall with that reddish brown fur. Very close relative of giraffe. It's easy to see side by side when you look at these two pictures how those animals could be related. And they even have that long giraffe tongue. There are actually a couple okapi here in Michigan at some zoos. And there's not too long ago, there's a baby okapi for you. Very cute animal. So a lot of the animals that we've been talking about, these have all been finds in like the 19th century, the early 20th century. I want to talk about one that's well within living memory of probably almost everybody who is watching this presentation. So I want to take you back to the 90s, right? So all of these pieces of technology existed, but they were all separate pieces rather than just on your smartphone. The year was 1996. So there are things like this is the year Pokemon debuts. Those are kind of all like little cryptids, right? I thought that's an appropriate way to talk about the year. The place is the Serdiman Range. The Serdiman Range is one of the least accessible mountain ranges anywhere on Earth. It's here in the middle of Papua New Guinea, so very difficult to get to. Papua New Guinea, it has a dense jungle. There are thousands of different ethnic and tribal groups that live around there with hundreds of languages, but many of these share a couple of common names. So the man of the forest, Bandigizu Mubaso, is something that was this common tale among the Monai people who lived around this island. There were several tribes of Monai people around Papua New Guinea. And Tim Flannery, who is there on the right, because, well, which of those two guys do you think is named Tim Flannery? Tim was a man who said, we've heard this time and time again, that the indigenous people will mention some kind of creature and animal. Europeans will dismiss it as, oh, that's a myth, or what are you're making things up. He said, no, I want to go out and find the Bandigiza Mabaso. And so he went out in 1996 on an expedition, and they found, this is the very first photo that we have of the animal that's now known as the Dingisu. That is this man of the forest that a lot of the Monai would be going out to find as part of a kind of coming of age ceremony. And the Dingisu, there's only a few photos of them. They are actually a furry kangaroo. They're the northernmost member of the kangaroo family, and they're an arboreal kangaroo. They live up in the trees. They have these little red eyes. They come out at night, and lo and behold, they weren't lying. They're definitely a real animal. But this is a sizable animal. This is something that, is going to weigh 15, 20, 25 pounds, depending on the exact specimen. Not a small little thing. It's one thing to think about, oh, they found a new species of beetle. Well, that happens all the time. There are millions and millions of different bug species, and it's not surprising to see bug species being found. But when we're talking about sizable animals, they can and do evade human contact as much as possible. So one of the last, HD pictures we have of these little kangaroos that live out in the jungle. So let's shift gears once again. We've talked a lot about land animals. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the cryptids on the ocean. Because, boy, if you thought that, there's places in land we don't know a lot about. The water and the oceans are so much bigger. It's so much more inhospitable to life. There's a lot we don't know about the oceans. The Kraken is this story of, a giant sea monster that could take down an entire ship, like a giant, octopus or something like that. Long tentacles. Here's one that's maybe a little bit more anatomically correct, and attacking a giant yawl there with just a couple of guys on board, but a huge tentacled creature. And these are something that people knew for a long time had to be real because the remains would wash up on shore. The problem is when something like a giant squid washes up on shore, they're used to living in the ocean. It just kind of deflates. Think about trying to take a jellyfish out of the water and then put it on a plate. It's just going to turn into a little puddle of goo. Very difficult to learn much about. And you can see they really deflate there. But the giant squid is enormous. It's hard to overstate just how big they are, because people just can't get a sense of scale of these. But if you parked 3 1992 Lincoln Town cars end to end to end, there would still be giant squid that have been measured that are longer than those 3 cars back to back to back. They're actually the only animal large enough to be a predator for things like the sperm whale. They're huge. And like I said, these pictures don't do it justice because they deflate. They've been eaten at. They've been picked at. They're starting to decompose when they wash up on shore. But there are other ways they know they were real. They had found pieces of skin from sperm whales that had these sucker marks, these round circular wounds from the tentacles of the giant squid from having these giant battles. They've even found squid or sperm whale that had washed up on shore, and they have all that scratch marks. Those are from the beak of a giant squid, where they would be biting at this huge whale. So some of the largest animals on Earth. And they have the largest eyeballs of any animal, the largest eyes, because it's the size of a dinner plate. They live down at the aphotic zone. So, sunlight just doesn't get down that far. They're down, 3,000 feet below the surface. That is incredibly deep. Very difficult for anything to live down that way, and they just live in complete darkness. So having that huge eyeball to take what little tiny light makes it down that way. But amazingly, it wasn't until the 21st century that we had our first photo of a living giant squid. It wasn't until the advent of more submarines and robotic submersibles. But this was from a manned submarine that went down. And believe me, if I was on a submarine in 2008 and I looked out my little porthole and I saw a 60-foot squid like this floating around, I would be telling them to go back up to the top. No, thank you. I do not want to see that. I'd be all submarined out because this is so big. So it's relatively recently that we have actual living photos of things like the giant squid, a real animal for sure. Again, anytime I get a chance to show you a baby animal, here's a little tiny baby squid to show you they're not all huge. That one would fit right on your finger, right? Pretty cute. How about the sea serpent? This is another type of these sea animals, like a giant snake that comes out and attacks ships. A very, very long creature. Lots of different depictions of this. And you have to remember, these animals are coming from a period where there are sailing vessels that would leave and just never arrive at their destination. They'd have to come up with some explanation for what happened to these sailing ships. So these sea monsters seem pretty plausible. Here's actually a pretty accurate drawing of the great sea serpent found in Hungary Bay, Bermuda in 1860. And it's a very accurate drawing of an oarfish. So the oarfish is absolutely a real type of fish. You can see there's a couple examples. These can grow, 30, 40 feet long, and that easily looks like a giant sea serpent like we see in those stories. And you can imagine how people's imaginations would run wild with those attacking ships. The amazing thing is they don't all start out that big. Here's one. They start out about the size of your palm. So they're not always huge. Let's talk about one more sea creature, mermaids, right? This is the kind of mermaid I grew up with Ariel, the little mermaid, right? But mermaids, there's a couple different types of mermaids. Some were very clearly faked. There were things like the mermaid that they're called Fiji mermaids. And these are ones that were, popular in the 19th century. We see them, and you can see this drawing of the Japanese artificial mermaid. What people would do is they would take a fish and sew it onto kind of the mummified remains of a monkey, and sew them together into some kind of creature. P.T. Barnum was famous for doing this. He had a Fiji mermaid on display at his American Museum in New York, and it was a fake. People kind of knew that. What I think is really funny is that he had such a great collection of exotic creatures. He had signs all over his museum that said, "This way to the egress," and people would be excited because I've never even heard of an egress, and they'd go through the door, and it would just put them outside, and they'd have to pay their quarter to come back into the museum. So they didn't realize, egress is just the exit, right? So, but the mysterious egress through the next door. But the other kind of mermaids that are quite a bit larger, there have been stories of these hybrids between people and fish, ancient Assyrian gods, half man, half fish. There are some of creatures that are, very more animalistic here with their fins. I'll show you my favorite engraving of a mermaid I've ever seen. It's from the 1620s, because usually mermaids don't still have like legs and feet. This one does. Some interesting proportions, but hey, I contend if you can do a better wood carving, I would like to see it. That's kind of a difficult thing to do. But as late as the 18th century, mermaids were considered just one of the things that live in the Caribbean that people had seen, that, along with these other fish, things like sawfish that are so strange looking, that they were just included with, they're out there. It was taken for granted that they did exist. In fact, Christopher Columbus claims to have seen a mermaid. He said, "They are not as beautiful as they are painted, since in some ways they have a face like a man." This is what he said on his first expedition to the New World in 1492. He said, "They have a face like a man." Well, this is the face that he's looking at, which I think is kind of funny. He was just running into a manatee. Manatees and dugongs, they're very similar. The difference is actually in their tails. Dugongs have a bifurcated tail, kind of like a whale, and manatees have a big fan-like tail. But there are manatees and dugongs all over the world. And I guess if you are a sailor and you're looking through the murky water, maybe they got seaweed or dust around them, I guess they can kind of remind you of a person vaguely. It kind of stretches the imagination a little bit. There were some kinds of animals like Stellar sea cow. These are actually all to scale. So there's a manatee up there in the top left, and the big one in the middle, you can see if by scale there's a person right above its tail. They lived around Japan, and they were actually hunted to extinction in the 1640s to the 1650s. So the Stellar sea cow just doesn't exist anymore. But it's no surprise that with them in the waters in Japan, Japan has its own history of part person, part fish hybrid creatures. So, but again, you look at those underwater and you see all the dust around them that, if you're really, really lonely and pretty bored, you might be able to see something. But there's a pretty cute little baby manatee for you as well. So Nessie bears a little bit of talking about. There's a lot of mystery about Nessie. Some people suggest that Nessie is actually a plesiosaur, so one of these ancient dinosaurs. And I always pictured plesiosaurs much bigger than this. This is not something I'd really want to go swimming with or anything, but I always pictured a plesiosaur as a huge animal, something you could ride on their back. But no, they're a little bit smaller than I think a lot of people think, and they were definitely a type of dinosaur. But one of the things that we have a hard time with is knowing exactly what they look like. In fact, the plesiosaur has really changed over the years. When they first were finding these fossils in the 1830s, they had this snake-like neck, and they were kind of like a seal and very amphibious and could flop around. But by the 1860s, they took the form of what most people imagine Nessie looks like today. But today they've done even more research. They've done some climate research, realized the waters that the plesiosaur was living in was probably a bit colder than they originally thought, and realized they would have had to have a lot more insulation. And it's a real challenge, because if you just have the fossilized remains of an animal, it's difficult to tell what that animal may have looked like without further evidence. I'll give you a quick example. The king of Sweden at one time had a pet lion. And when this pet lion, obviously not native to Sweden, died, he sent it off to a taxidermist to be stuffed and mounted. And even though they already knew what a lion looked like, this is what they did with the remains they had. This still isn't, a great rendition of oh, you tried, right? Good attempt. And that's with an animal they knew about. Imagine just having maybe some of the bones of another animal and how difficult it would be. You see a skull like this, and you think that's a terrifying looking dinosaur, right? Something that you just I wouldn't want to be eaten by that, but it's actually a hippopotamus. There's no way to, if you don't know what's on the outside of those bones, it can vary quite a bit. You see something, scurrying like this, and it could be like a little mink or an ermine or something like that, or it could be an iguana. It all depends. There's no way to know scales or fur or what's exactly on the outside. I'll give you one more little example of, I like these bones. One artist said, "Oh, this looks like some kind of almost sci-fi creature," but really, that's a baboon, completely different shape because it's got the long hair on the outside, something you wouldn't know from just fossilized remains. So very difficult to reconstruct something like that. Another fossil we need to talk about, any talk about cryptids would be remiss if we didn't include the coelacanth. The coelacanth was the favorite fish of famous biologist Louis Agassiz in the 19th century. He was a big kind of opponent of Darwin, but he was rather famous in the 19th century with the animals that he was looking at. He helped found the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. But the coelacanth was interesting because they really thought this was kind of a missing link or somewhere in there, because the fins looked almost like proto feet, like they could have been something that maybe turned into one of the first land animals. But the thing about the coelacanth fossils is they dated them all. And as I mentioned, they included them at that Comparative Zoological Museum, looking at all of these fossils and where they fit into this great chain of life, into that great tree. And they realized that these fossils disappeared 66 million years ago, the same time that we know an asteroid hit the planet and that all of the dinosaurs would disappear. So the logical assumption was, well, they're obviously gone. But here's the thing. They were gone until 1938, when a ship, a fishing vessel off the coast of South Africa, would pick up one of the weirdest looking fish they'd ever seen. They'd reel it in, and when they got back, they even tried a couple bites. They said it tasted awful. And they took this to Marjorie Courtney Latimer, who was at their local East London Museum in South Africa. And it had already started to decay and rot, but she had it preserved and took it to other ichthyologists who study fish. And lo and behold, it was a coelacanth. They said, how can this be? We thought these were extinct, but here's one before us. So they tried very hard to find another one, although World War II kind of got in the way. So it was many years. It wasn't until 1952 that they were able to capture another example of the coelacanth. Here you can see everybody was very excited to have reeled one in kind of the deep oceans off of the coast of South Africa. And the coelacanth was actually the inspiration for the Creature from the Black Lagoon, that movie that came out just a couple of years later. They wanted something that looked like it was an ancient hybrid between man and fish. And so that creature would be based on the coelacanth. And we know today they're all over. It takes a lot of very specialized conditions for an animal to become fossilized. And so they just move to deeper water. So even though they disappear from the fossil record, sadly, we won't know about the vast majority of animals in Earth's history, animals that have gone extinct millions of years ago that just didn't leave behind fossilized remains. We won't know about them. We'll have maybe genetic evidence in animals that are alive today, but if they aren't forming those perfect conditions, there's another example of a living coelacanth. And so there have been some questions about some other animals that may fall into that same category of they're claimed to be extinct, but are they really? Excuse me. The ancient moa, the largest flightless bird to ever exist in New Zealand. They were supposedly hunted to extinction when early man arrived on New Zealand, and they were pretty easy and big targets. How would you like drumsticks like that at Thanksgiving dinner? But every once in a while, someone will claim, "Oh, I thought, I saw something that fits that description way out in, the forest in New Zealand." Tasmania is probably less famous for the Tasmanian devil. There's the real one, not the cartoon one. I think they're pretty cute. There's some babies, but they're also pretty mean. They're also known for the Tasmanian tiger. And these, according to science, have been extinct since the 1930s. The Tasmanian tiger is almost this weird niche that's like half big cat and half wild dog. Really looks like it's somewhere in between those two animals. They've got those distinctive stripes. And the last one, like I said, that they know of was shot in 1932, and they were rendered extinct, which is pretty sad. They've even talked about using genetic examples to bring them back, like the woolly mammoth, using cloning techniques and things like that to bring them back from extinction. It's unclear if they would be able to do that or if they even need to, because about 6 months ago, a farmer caught this on one of his trail cams, rummaging around in his backyard. Some of his wildlife, his chickens, had been eaten. And I don't know about you, but it sure looks like a Tasmanian tiger to me. So all it takes is one example to disprove that they are really extinct. And if an animal doesn't want to be found, there's a lot of places for them to hide. So I want to talk about one last animal, cryptid, category of cryptid. And this is the cryptid that I think is the most likely to turn out to be real. Now, there is Bigfoot. There's a lot of stories with the Sasquatch, these large primates. Even orangutan actually means man of the forest in Malay. And there are, they have a lot of people-like tendencies, right? These cute little orangutans remind us a lot of ourselves. But the cryptid, the giant primate, it's a cryptid that I think is most likely to be real, is a very specific one. It's not Bumbles, but it is the Yeti, the abominable snowman. So the abominable snowman, that's actually a phrase that isn't used until 1921 with the British Mount Everest reconnaissance expedition. When they were investigating climbing, and they discovered that it was, in fact, the world's tallest mountain, and they had claimed to see a Yeti up in the Himalayas on that expedition. But there have been lots of reports of what appear to be a giant primate in the Himalayas. Here are some footprints. Photos that had been taken in 1937. Like, what else, could that be? These footprints that wander off. Because if I have to pick a reason why I think the Yeti is probably more likely to be real than, say, Bigfoot. Bigfoot lives in a place where humans can easily go. Hunters go out in the woods all the time, and they're carrying rifles. So it seems like if Bigfoot would be really real, maybe a hunter would have shot him by now, right? But the Himalayas are not a place where people frequently go. There's another set of footprints, and what's interesting about these is they were taken by the Indian Army. They have special forces up there on the border with China. And they don't seem like the kind of people who'd just be joking around, right? So they included these Yeti footprints in a tweet in 2019. Sir Edmund Hillary, Tenzing Norgay, they, on their first successful climb and descent from Mount Everest, would claim to have seen a Yeti. The native people of Bhutan say, yeah, there's absolutely Yetis. Bhutan, Nepal, India, people who live in these Himalayan regions who are indigenous there say the Yeti's absolutely real. So how many times have we seen this story again and again and again, where native people say, oh, it's absolutely real, and it's Europeans who need to be convinced of that until they find, kind of the concrete evidence that they're looking for. The problem is in the Himalayas, it's difficult to get because so few people are living up in the same area where the Yeti might live. There have been some theories about the Yeti. Some people suggest it's maybe, a displaced group of polar bears or something like that. But I am more inclined to believe that it is a primate. There are a number of primate species. We're Homo sapiens. We're just one of these species. And they keep finding new ones that probably existed at the same time as humans within the last, 10 to 50,000 years. Humans have been around for about 200,000 years. Homo florensis was just discovered in 2003. They described this as hobbit man, about 2/3 the size of a human. And they realized that they would have overlapped with humans living in Indonesia, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, in that time period. Prehistory, to be sure, but they said, wow, that's an amazing discovery to make. You look at primates, we're all specialized for where they live. Gigantopithecus blacki is one of the largest primates that's ever been discovered. It's like 12, 13 feet tall. You look at that skull compared to a human skull and realize that's just huge. And so who's to say that there isn't a primate that was specially adapted to maybe living up in the Himalayas with the lower oxygen level and the thinner air, living at the high altitude, and just doesn't want to be found. All swans are white until you find a black swan, right? So there's this opportunity to come up. So I want to leave you with one, I think, pretty compelling piece of evidence. Eric Shipton took this picture in 1952. And again, wow, you look at that footprint and you got to try and think, like, what else would cause a footprint like that up in the Himalayas? So you just have to ask yourself, is this going to be something like the continental plates? 100 years ago, people were laughed at for believing in it. Today, it's something they teach in elementary school. If the Yeti is out there, I think they're the most likely one to be found. All of those creatures that I think you might be able to justify a lot of that evidence for. We heard that story time and time again. But my name is Andrew Kercher. I hope that you enjoyed this. That's my website. There's kercher.info. My email address, andrewlkercher@gmail.com. I do a number of different lectures and talks. I speak all over Southeast Michigan. I do hybrid events. I do online events, just like this one, if you're watching online. I really enjoy it. So if that's something you're interested in, there's, kind of how to get a hold of me. But I think I will stop sharing here because I think we'll look at maybe any questions if we have any. So we'll head back. There we go. So did that, we were playing around with this a little bit earlier. Jen, did that work?
Yep, that worked. So does anybody have any questions for Andrew? You can unmute yourself.
So like I said, if not, you can always get a hold of me. Kercher.info is my website. I'm always happy to talk Yetis, or I do a lot of automotive and Michigan history, but cryptids are pretty fun to talk about. And like I said, if you're a true believer, I hope I gave you some ammunition to go out there to, convince your friends and neighbors. And if you're a total skeptic, I hope that maybe you left just enough room for that epistemological pry bar to make a little bit more room in there for something like a Yeti to move in. So I think it's hubris to claim that we know everything or what's really out there and what's not. And you got to leave room for the possibility for some of those more fun creatures that live out there, because Lord knows it's happened enough in the past.
You. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely.